I'm telling you that my teams did them ad nauseum. I want to be prepared for everything. I didn't, and I would lock all this out of my mind, not to get sidetracked on your question, but I wouldn't take any mock drafts into consideration until that week before the draft.
You got your Mac guys here on Birds 365, McMullen, McDonald, and we are lucky enough to have as our next guest, former executive of the year in the NFL and general manager of both the Saints and the Dolphins. He is the head creator of content for MuellerFootball.com. If he's going to call it that, he better be the head creator of content for MuellerFootball.com. He contributes for Fox Sports and The Athletic as well. Randy Mueller joins us here on Birds 365. How you been, Randy?
I'm doing great, guys. Always brings a smile to my face to be back with you guys. I don't know why. Maybe it's all of us with gray hair. I don't know.
It brings a comfort to us all with the gray hair. It's coming for everybody, Randy.
I hear you.
It's good to have you on this week. When I contacted you, I didn't know Howie Roseman was going to make this trade, but you have a history with the New Orleans Saints, so I have to ask you, what the heck was Mickey thinking with this trade? What is the thought process from a GM standpoint with this particular trade from both angles? I think it's more obvious from Philadelphia's angle, but what do you think New Orleans was the thought process there?
Well, I know from my history and really growing up with Mickey, we were together for 20-some years. My guess is there's another shoe that has to drop, John. I think making this move was probably the first of a couple. I do also tells me that they have their board set for this year, which is a little early, which surprises me. They know where players are going to run out, so to speak. And maybe it's 20 people that they feel quality, really good values about. They have 2 picks in that top 20 now. And we know the Saints need volume this year. They're trying to move some things around cap-wise. So the only really impact players they're going to be able to add because of the cap is through the draft. And this might allow them to add 2. If not, it gives them some versatility and maybe being able to move up another step as we get closer. You wouldn't make a deal like this now for a particular player because you don't know who's going to be there. So I think it was fascinating from my end is to see the different philosophies. And you mentioned Howie and the Eagles, who are much more analytically driven, much more trade draft chart driven, in my opinion. Mickey won't be like that. He'll be a supply and demand guy. There'll be more of a timing to build our team as opposed to going off any charts or draft codes or anything like that. So a different philosophy, maybe old school, a little bit against, new school. But I think there's value for both these teams in making these deals. They're just building their teams in different ways. That's all.
All right, you answered the question I was going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway because I need slightly more of an answer. The NFL and the way it usually does, and what you did when you were in the position of being the lead guy as a general manager of a team. Calendar draft question. We're 3 weeks out. How formulated is your draft board? You mentioned you think Mickey, by this trade, is kind of showing they really like where they're at 3 weeks out. Mm-hmm. Other teams may do it differently, may just have formulas in place, and then are really going to zero in when they get to within a week. There might be teams that have had it in place for a month and go, all right, we're done. We'll come back. We'll tweak a little bit the week of, but we know what we like. We know what we don't like.
Right.
What is the general timing of draft calendars, if you can even give us a best guess scenario on that? What are you trying to do 3 weeks out from the draft?
Well, I think for the most part, your draft board has been set by the personnel people for now a couple weeks. And those guys, along with some assistant coaches, have been out on the road at pro days, finalizing some workout information. And then they're coming back in this week to figure out how to use these numbers that they've gathered the last couple weeks. I don't think it's going to make a big difference in where these cards are, but they're going to tweak some things. The other thing is that's important for people to know is coaches aren't really involved in the process until maybe the combine starts. And then their input gets taken. So I think last week, maybe this week, maybe next week, depending on each team, that input is going to be taken into account. So you may see some players move around on your board based on what coaches' evaluations are. And again, I can only speak for my past in that the coaches part of it was the last part of the calendar. That was the last input we really received. And so we wouldn't jump players around drastically at that point, but you can surely move them up and down within levels and grading scales a little bit when you get the coach's input. So I think those things have happened, or at least are starting to happen. I've made deals, early on in the process. One year we made a deal when we moved from 10 up to 3, and that was probably a month before the draft. But I also knew that I was going to be happy with any one of 3 players when we went up there. And one of them happened to be at a particular position of need for us. So we felt like it was comfortable to go up and make that move ahead of time. We also had some intel as to what the other teams ahead of us were going to do, and there was only 2 teams. That's impossible to do when you have 15 teams. You can't have all the intel on the 15 picks ahead of you. So it was a little easier to do going up that high in the draft that year. So every draft is different, though, guys. I find it fascinating that the quality, like we said, may run out at pick 20 for the Saints. There may be other teams that say the quality runs out for them at pick 10 or 11. So the values that they put on these drafts from a depth standpoint and from an impact player standpoint, I think always fascinate me, and it's different in every building.
What fascinates me about particular drafts from year to year is the valuation of draft slots compared to the quarterback class. In other words, when you have a highly regarded quarterback class like 2023 as opposed to way too early, but people think Bryce Young's going to be up there and CJ Stroud and maybe a few others as opposed to this year's. And some people love Kenny Pickett, some people love Malik Willis, but as a whole, the quarterback class is not as highly regarded as some other recent ones. How does that affect the other draft slots? As far as valuing when teams are looking to trade, does it lessen those, or am I making too much of it? In other words, I guess I always say rising tides, lift all boats. Right. When the quarterback position is strong, does that make every pick in the first round a little bit more valuable?
Well, there's no question your supply and demand changes, and I think that's really at the end of the day what dictates value. It's just like it is in the real market of business. It's supply and demand when you come to looking at quarterbacks. This year, you're right. There doesn't seem to be a lot of consensus. I see, a grade or a report or an evaluation here or there on a particular player or quarterback, but there's no real consensus. So if I were a team, let's say, for example, the Chiefs at 29 or 30, wherever they are, I wouldn't feel as good about what's going to slip down to me as I would if there were 4 or 5 quarterbacks that were available. Obviously, if I need a defensive player or something like that, I'm hoping every quarterback gets drafted because obviously, and I'm just using them as an example. Something else is going to slip down to me. That's probably not going to happen this year. They're not going to have something fall in their lap that they would last year, so to speak, when 5 quarterbacks got picked in the top 15 or whatever it was. So it affects the other positions a lot and how far they may slide. Time will tell. I just think that the quarterback evaluation this year to me has just been fascinating, and all of us have opinions, right? But here's the big difference. I don't think fans actually realize that much of. You can look and read your one person evaluations all you want, but these clubs know 5 and 6 times what we all know on the outside.
Yeah.
And they have 5 of those opinions internally that they've discussed ad nauseum. And usually the truth lies in the middle. So it's not about Jody being right and me being wrong, or John being right and Jody being wrong. It's about what we have to do together and reaching a consensus. And that's what these teams do. They reach consensus. So it's really their final ranking of a player has been 5 or 6 times vetted by all these different outlets and all within our own division, or on our own building. What we see on the outside as fans is one person's opinion on one thing. It's just not as inclusive as the information that is going to come out of an NFL building.
All right, Randy, got another just general draft question for you. We hear teams talk about it after the fact, guys who've done it like yourself. you need to be careful not to reach. You have a position of need. You have your draft board in order. You're coming up. You're a couple of picks away. Yeah, you really need this one position, but you got 2 or 3 players ranked ahead of them where they'd be reserves on your team, could eventually become starters. But do you reach for that guy? Understand the concept of it, get it across the board. It's a tricky road you got to navigate.
Yeah, it's a great question.
How often does it come this way? I want you to comment on that, but also this. You're coming up on a pick, and you see a guy who's the top-rated player at the position, but you know that position is really deep. That there you've got high grades on 10 or 11 players at a position, and you're making your first round pick. You go, we could use a safety, and he's high enough to be rated to take there. But damn, we got 11 safeties. If we get one in the second round, that's fine. If we go one in the third round, that's fine. Yeah, it's a drop off, but not that bad a drop off. And to get a starter in the third round, how much does that come up that you will actually, while you're on the board, coming up the next couple of picks, look at the depth of a position to say, I think we can pass here because we can get a guy later on in the draft, which you're never really going to know because they keep getting picked off right before you're about to call their name. How much does that play into thinking in the top round on an NFL draft?
It definitely plays, but I would say this, Jody, you've discussed almost every scenario prior to the draft. So those thoughts don't really come through your mind when you're approaching the clock, but you've discussed them for weeks, every scenario possible. So it's just like a game plan on Sunday.
Whoa, hold on. Are you telling me that NFL teams do mock drafts? They mock themselves in their war room days and days and days before the draft?
I'm telling you that my teams did them ad nauseum. I want to be prepared for everything. I didn't, and I would lock all this out of my mind, not to get sidetracked on your question, but I wouldn't take any mock drafts into consideration until that week before the draft. Then I instructed all of our guys, bring all that crap in. Bring every mock draft you've ever seen in. Bring it all in because we're going to go through it all. And I don't even care whose name is on it, but I want to discuss everything that's on there because I don't want to have a surprise on draft day. So we would spend a couple days doing mock drafts. I want to discuss it all. And as the craziest idea, the craziest mock I've ever seen, I don't care. I want to talk about it. So I didn't have to decide on the clock just the scenario that you peeled off. I think it's the need versus best player is the biggest Pandora's box in the draft. And I think it also requires discipline. It requires confidence. It requires all the above for a GM to do. I think it's really hard to stand pat. But if you've discussed everything you just brought up, Jody, all the possibilities, all the depth at positions, you're going to have a plan when you walk in that room. And I'm not to over dramatize, but I've walked in many draft mornings feeling better than any day of the year because I know we had talked about everything. There was going to be no surprises. There's nothing you can do that we haven't talked about. And I'll give you one example. In New Orleans one year, we had all of our coaches used to be in the draft room. Some teams don't let anybody in the draft room. There's 4 or 5 guys. I always believe in including everybody because they've all been part of the process. But we're sitting at the draft table one day and there's a little bit of chatter and noise around us as the picks are coming off. And Mr. Benson taps me on the shoulder and he says, "Here, Andy, does all this noise bother you?" And I had to think for a minute and I looked around and I said, "What noise?" we knew exactly what we were doing. So the noise didn't even factor in. When I say noise, I'm talking about actual talking around the room, a lack of focus or whatever. We were locked in and didn't have to worry about these picks coming off because we knew exactly what we're going to do. So I think it all depends on your setting, on the people around you, how comfortable you are. And compare it to this. If you're going to take a test, you're anxious most of the time when you walk in that test room because you want to, if you haven't studied enough, you're going to be nervous about it. Well, these guys have all studied every day for 300 days now. So if they walk in there feeling anxious, that just tells me they're not prepared. So the two go hand in hand. I think that to go back and quickly answer what you're talking about, the choice of need and jumping that up above the best player available is a hard thing, but you've doing the whole board, the whole process a disservice if you do that and jump levels of value per se. if you have the board stacked strategically to fill your kind of needs that you've talked about, you can't put needs blindly in a corner and not worry about that. You've got to be able to discuss it. And you usually have, a seasoned GM will have choices within a value, a group of players within a little cluster. So you stack those within that cluster, maybe as opposed to how you need them more than anything else. So I think you can accomplish both if you stack your board, with any thought process with levels 2, 3, 4 type thinking.
Randy, well, these days, I don't think you could have enough time in the day to look at every single mock draft because everybody does one every day, it seems. But you did mention Tom Benson there. So I want to talk about ownership. We have Jeffrey Lurie here in Philadelphia, who's owned the Eagles for, I think, 28 years now. So pretty large sample size. For the most part, a very well-regarded owner around the NFL. Mm-hmm. Interesting thing about Jeffrey, though, to me, Randy, is he's a very inquisitive guy. He likes to ask questions, as he always describes it. And one of the things I think he doesn't get is because he's the owner of the team, his questions carry a heck of a lot of weight. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think he thinks he's one of the guys. And if he says something, it might tilt somebody to go in a certain direction. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about all that process and consensus and being ready for everything. What happens if the owner comes in and says something that perks up the ears, even if it's just a suggestion?
Right. I think, first off, the fact that he would ask questions is good for everybody. I think it keeps the football people sharp. I just don't think they can roll out thoughts or ideas or statements without having them backed up because they know Jeffrey gets it. That's a big thing. And not to say that Tom Benson didn't get it. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He trusted us implicitly. But I went from there, having come from Seattle, where Paul Allen would ask some questions as well. He may not be present every day, but there were very few days where I didn't get emails or questions sent. So, and like he used to say, I don't care what you say. It just has to be what you say, if that makes any sense. He's never going to put words in your mouth. But if you tell him this is the way it's going to be, it has to be that way. So I tend to think that's what Jeffrey's looking for is just the people around him to qualify what they say and to have backing. And I'm sure Howie has that. I do think you have to be confident and strong enough to not always give him the answers you think he's looking for. I think you've got to stand on your own. And if you don't agree with the statement, be okay with that. But something tells me again that Jeffrey's okay with that as well. It just forces you to be sharper at your job. And therefore, I think ownership is a big part of the drafting process. They may not be in there watching tape, nor do they have to be, but questions are really important to keep us all accountable. And I love that part of it. I think it's great. I would welcome as much of that, as long as a little bit of pushback is okay, which I would think most smart people, most leaders are okay with a little bit of pushback if it makes sense.
All right, Randy, I'm going to take you back onto the NFL calendar again. 3 weeks to the draft. That goes hand in hand with free agency. Free agency always comes first. Teams put out big bucks for players, availability, grab up your guys. You got to pay them through the roof. But the further you go into free agency, as you start to close in on a draft, the number of players available come down and the price per player starts to come down as well because teams have filled needs. Right. We're about 3 weeks out. Is this a good time to be able to get a free agent? Maybe sell them on, hey, you want to sign before the draft because once teams start the draft, your position is going to get eaten up there, big guy. Make a good, solid, take it or leave it offer for a particular player who would be still sitting on the free agency list a month after free agency starts. Good time or bad time to get a deal done?
Oh, I think it's a good time. I think for the next month and a half, it's a good time to get a veteran deal done. I think you have to work the people that are available in the pool now against what's available in the draft, and you've got to fill needs. So that's the best way to do it. And most teams now are looking for value type contracts. That's not to say they're not important signings. I think they're really important, but they've got to find them at the right value for them. So yes, I think from a negotiating standpoint, it's a good time. as I think it will be even after the draft. But right now you have that lure, like you say, Jody, of, hey, I might draft somebody if you don't take this deal. So I do think it's a good angle to come at players with. But here's the bottom line: is you don't want to pressure them to the point where they don't think they're if they think they're just a need fill or a pawn in a big scheme. Sometimes that factors in negotiating as well. So you've got to be respectful of them and their process, but at the same time, try to make it work for you as well to fill a particular need. I always used that theory of signing a few veteran guys, like you said, at, I won't say minimum salary, but close to it. Because if you could get them signed beforehand, it sure gives you more options come draft time. You don't have to do anything in the draft to fill a specific need. So it was almost like insurance for us in the draft.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, if we can get a couple veterans signed at reasonable prices, we can do anything in the draft, which always lends me back to then we're going to take the highest valued player, which is the goal of at least my goal was for each round, if we could do it.
Right.
Randy, you mentioned minimum salaries there. I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum. As a former league executive, are you surprised at all at the explosion in the wide receiver markets? Stephon Diggs being the latest, but obviously Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill. And how does that affect an executive's thinking in that, maybe we want to go more cost effective at this position by going with the younger player in the draft than having this huge financial outlay? We're used to it at quarterback, but right. I'm a little surprised at how the wide receiver market exploded simply because that's a position that needs a vehicle to get them the football. I mean, right. So they're dependent on someone else. Does it surprise you at all?
Yes, it surprised me a lot. And I'm with you. I think you get to a certain point with a non-quarterback salary negotiating, and there comes a choking point for everybody. And I think we've seen that in Kansas City. We didn't see it in Buffalo because they were able to hang on to it, but we saw it in Green Bay as well, where teams would rather be able to use that 25 or 30 million in cap space to build out the rest of their team. So it's going to be fascinating to watch how this works out, because obviously Miami, the Raiders, they think it's good to have these star receivers and have no problem paying for them. I think where I struggle with the concept of paying those non-quarterbacks that amount of money is, if let's just say you're paying a guy like Tyreek Hill $30 million a year, and don't hold me to those exact numbers. Depends on what version of the contract you see, but the cap number this year is $15 million. What does that tell you that it's going to be at the end of the deal? I'm no math major. I grew up in Idaho, but I think that puts that cap number in the last couple of years at $45 and $50 million. That's crazy. I mean, I don't know how you could have a receiver on your team with a cap number of $45 million. It also tells me that these guys have more information than we do. These guys as in GMs, in that they think the cap's going to go way up.
Yeah.
So they have to be able to forecast with some reasonable assurance that they can stomach a $40-45 million cap hit for a non-quarterback. That's hard. And I think that'll be interesting part for me to see it play out, is do these contracts become real contracts, or are they all really 1 and 2 and maybe 3-year type deals, because it's going to be cost, deficient to have that guy long-term.
Randy, I don't know if you know this, but my father was a general manager in professional baseball, St. Louis Cardinals, New York Mets, Detroit Tigers. And he once told me one of the toughest things about being a general manager is you have to be able to scout your own scouts, because you are depending on them for information. And much like a draft, much like a player, not every scout is exactly the same. Some are more often going to go to hyperbole and describing a player and give higher grades, and other guys going to be much tougher graders. And hey, I know it's only but he doesn't give this grade out because how difficult was that for you as a general manager? You're leading into the draft. You've got to lean on other people because you're busy running the team. You watch some football game. You're going to watch a lot of tape, but you're not there in the trenches going to talk to assistant coaches and the like. So you've got to trust your scouts. How difficult was that?
It's absolutely giant. And it's a great question, because you have to evaluate the evaluators. I mean, and that includes coaches as well. There are some coaches that I've been around that are great evaluators. There are others that are awful. So I'm going to hear them out, but I'm not going to listen to every word, or their track record isn't as good. Scouts are a little bit the same way. You've got to evaluate the information gatherers. You've got to evaluate the guys who really know what they see on film and then can articulate it in a way. I think you're right. Some rooms, draft rooms, might have a couple, and I'll say carnival barkers, guys that talk loud, guys that get up on the table, but it doesn't really back up, the guy who talks loudest shouldn't be thought of the most in a room.
Right.
So yeah, it's leading. That's leading in leadership in my mind, Jody, is you got to listen to everybody, but you got to know who you listen to about what and when to listen to them. And here's the other thing. Not everybody is good at evaluating, even though they're in that room. And I say that about coaches, but I also say it about scouts too. Some evaluators are really good at evaluating certain positions. And so knowing the room and reading the room is giant. You've got to listen to it all, and you've got to come to a consensus. And because one guy talks loud and one guy talks small doesn't mean the emphasis should be on the guy who gets the last word either. So you've got to find the happy medium in the sweet spot of where, let's just say, where the Eagles end up as a group on one particular player. So it's I love that part of the process. I really do. I miss the process itself. And that's a big part of it, is knowing and working with the people and all the parts, putting it together.
Last one for me, Randy, and follow Randy on Twitter at Randy Mueller _MuellerFootball.com. You got the Football GM pod on The Athletic, Fox Sports Radio, and right here on Burst 365. We always love it when Randy stops by. I think you were Executive of the Year in 2000. So we're in 2022, Randy. And the NFL just came out with its off-season schedule for workouts, and teams with new coaches could start basically last week. Here in Philadelphia, the Eagles have scrapped mandatory minicamp. They're one of two teams with the Cincinnati Bengals. The process that you talk about, and we're not talking just the whole season, the calendar, the way it used to be versus the way it is today. The NFL, in its collective bargaining, gave up some things to get more games and more revenue. One was practice time. Did these guys have the time to prepare properly, or have they shifted and sort of said, well, we don't have the time, so let's get everybody to week one as healthy as possible? Have you heard that sort of sentiment around the NFL?
I think there's some of that. I think it depends on who you ask and who your coach is, on his philosophy and how he feels about off season. Sometimes I'm good with these rules that give players a little bit of a break from their coaches, and coaches a little bit of a break from themselves. I'm okay with that. I think we've all seen the mental part of the game and mental health enter into it. And I think that you're healthier the less you get grinded down in the off season. I think the happy medium comes when you're having to be sharp physically, and fresh mentally at the same time. So I think we're still looking to find that fine line there. But I think there's a sentiment around the league that it's okay that we don't have these long drawn out off seasons. Hey, for years, we had one mini camp the weekend after the draft, and that's it. That's the only time we saw our players. And that lasted forever. I mean, that was into the 2000s, really. We didn't have all the off season stuff that's, thrown at these guys right now. So I'm okay with it. I think you're right, John, in that you need to get players healthy for the first regular season game, especially with 17 weeks now. The seasons are a long grind, and I think getting away is good. And like I said, I think it's helped mentally prepare these guys as much as anything. Let them do their own thing if that's what they want to do. I'm a little surprised that the Eagles would eliminate the mandatory weekend, or because it's just 3 days. I would just like to see our people at some point, bring them into the room. I don't care how much we do with them, but I would like to, from a classroom standpoint, get them sharp on any things we're thinking about, team-wise, install-wise, that kind of stuff. So there's probably a happy medium with that as well. I don't know if I'd turn them loose for the whole offseason, that's for sure.
Randy, last one for me. I need one name. And you've already exhibited the fact that you get mock drafts. They're kind of like buttholes. Everyone has one. And you put the right amount of emphasis on it, put it in its proper perspective. I'm sure people are asking you to do that and give your evaluation on the players, and you're taking in everybody else's information. There's got to be one guy who, when you're reading other people's drafts, you've got your numbers, you've done your work, you have your evaluation, you go, how the hell is this guy up in the top 10? He wouldn't even be a first-round draft pick for me. Or a guy that is not in the first round that you go, damn, I think about taking this guy at 7. How do people not have him in the first round? There's got to be one guy, either positive or negative, that you've got an opinion on this year that it seems like most other people don't share that opinion. Who's that player?
Well, I would say for me this year, and the quarterbacks are where the fascination is, but I get it. The Malik Willises of the world, I really struggle with. I just don't know how you could look at that film, what he put on film, and nothing against him. I'm sure he's a great kid, but I could not see, and I've watched a lot of tape, I couldn't make the connection and connect all the dots of what I saw with him and connect that to being an NFL starting quarterback. I just couldn't. I see the flashes of arm. I see this or that in little small snippets, but I just can't connect those dots. I don't know if that makes sense, Jody. I just can't do it. So that one's a really hard one for me. I mean, I tried to, and I've heard and seen the evaluations. And so I go back and look at more film, and I just end up again shaking my head saying, I can't take that leap of faith. Sorry. I mean, he may be a great player someday, but I just couldn't do it in this day and age for what we need right now. There's not a lot that he does that an NFL team is going to ask him to do. And so that's why I converse and compare him with a guy like Kenny Pickett, who does everything already that NFL teams are going to ask him to do. So it's a little easier leap of faith for me.
Really great stuff. We appreciate it. Whenever you do come on, we'll get you on again after the draft where you can go, man, that team just stone it cold, nailed it, or what the hell were the Saints doing on draft day? So we appreciate you jumping on before the draft. We're definitely going to get you on again after the draft. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Randy.
That is Randy Mueller. You got to check out his website, MuellerFootball.com. All right. MAGA Mac guys coming back. You know what we need to do. Put a bow in it.